So in this video, I'm going to be taking the past 10 decades, I believe, everything from the 1920s to the 2020s that we are obviously currently in, and I'm going to be just looking through things that have happened and different trends and popular symbols and stuff from those decades to make Pokemon teams based on each one of those decades. So this is sort of if each decade in history was manifested into a sort of gym leader for Pokemon or something like that. But anyway, what I did when I was doing this is I tried my best to make every single team its own type. So obviously I wanted each team to be like a specialist in a certain type, but I was also trying to make it so that no two teams had the same type, and also so that no two teams had the same exact Pokemon. So one team's not going to have, let's say, a Golem if it's a ground-type team. If there's a rock-type team, that's not going to have a Golem as well, just because Golem's rock and ground. It's not... Every Pokemon only is going to appear once, unless it appears twice on a team, which does happen once or twice in this video. So, because of that, this was a little hard to make. I did run into some, complications trying to find a Pokemon of just the specific type that actually fit an event from the decade I was looking at, since I had to stay set of just one type per decade. But anyway, just to get right into it, starting with the 2020s. Obviously, the 2020s just started. We're only 3 years in, but everybody knows that the biggest thing that's really happened so far was the whole pandemic that happened. So I instantly thought to make the 2020s a poison-type specialist, and the ace for this team is a wheezing, because obviously wheezing is a symptom of respiratory illness, and also it kind of looks like a virus cell, so wheezing is the ace of this team. Or it could be Crobat, just because people speculated the whole pandemic started with bats. And then the team also has Beedrills to represent that whole murder hornet spook that happened back in 2020, Salazzle to represent the wildfires that were happening in 2020, Overquill to represent the World War III speculations, Ariados to represent the lockdowns that we had. And I was kind of thinking, spiders make webs and they trap things, and we were essentially trapped in lockdown. So that was the little connection there. And then lastly, Tentacruel, because a lot of people have not enjoyed the 2020s so far and have considered many of the things that have happened cruel, and Tentacruel is cruel in its name. So yeah, that's the 2020s, a poison-type team. Next up is the 2010s, and I made this team sort of a weaker team. It's essentially the weakest team on the list, so think of it as sort of a earlier gym, if these were all considered gym leaders, but not really. These are just supposed to be teams, because they all have 6 members, so it's not like this would really be an easier gym leader. It's just that it's the weakest team I made, and it is a normal type specialist. The ace for the 2010s team is Hisuian Zoroark, and I picked that because I was just trying to find one normal type, because I had already picked a normal type based on some other members I'd picked for the team. I was trying to find one that best represented the whole theory that the world was going to end in 2012, and obviously no normal type really represented that. Also, I want to point out I tried my best not to use any mythicals or legendaries on these teams, because it wouldn't make sense that just some random gym leader or something would have a legendary or mythical. There is one mythical or legendary that appears on one of the teams, but that's only because it worked all too well. Other than that, there's none of them. So, Hisuian Zoroark, it kind of represents an end-of-the-world thing, or at least the best of any normal type, because, it's like an evil guy that hates humans, so kind of works. In addition to that, there's 2 cast forms on this team, one that would utilize its rainy form to represent the hurricanes that happened in the 2010s, and also some climate change activism and that kind of stuff. And then the other cast form would utilize the snow form to represent the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, as well as climate change stuff. There's also a Porygon Z to represent the rise of social media and a lot of technologies and stuff. Specifically Porygon Z, because that's the corrupted one, and social media has had a questionable effect on us. There's also Slack Off to represent such silly trends of the 2010s, including planking. I picked Slack Off because it looks like it's in a planking position, and I was only thinking of planking because I was just desperately scanning through things of the 2010s and I ran into planking, so yeah. And lastly, there's Loudred to represent the goofy dance trends and the music that came with them that we had, including Gangnam Style and Harlem Shake. So yeah, this is probably like the stupidest team that I came up with. I'm not very proud of this one, but yeah, the 2010s, a normal type team. Next up is the 2000s, which is a dragon type team, and its ace is Duraludon. I really didn't want to do a 9/11 thing because it's more of a sensitive topic. I was trying to stick more of like the not really bad stuff for these, but like every single article I looked through to find what kind of defined the 2000s, what happened, that just kept coming up. And Duraludon looks like a skyscraper, so I just did it anyway. But on a lighter note, I also put Duraludon in there because apparently the world's first cyborg was made in the 2000s, and it's a steel type, so that works. There's also Garchomp to represent this earthquake that apparently happened in the Indian Ocean in 2004. That also came up a lot, so I guess that was a big thing. I wouldn't know because I wasn't alive, but yeah. Then there's Appleton to represent the Apple company releasing the iPod and the iPhone and some other neat stuff in the 2000s. Then Zygarde Complete Form. This is that one legendary I said would happen. I only put this here because the Human Genome Project was completed in the 2000s. I don't know exactly what that means. I guess like they fully understood the human genome. I mean, that's just kind of... that makes sense. That's what I assume it would mean, but Zygarde is obviously made up of a bunch of different cells and stuff, and you have to put them together, and this is his complete form, so it just works really well. Then there's Roaring Moon, to represent the fact that a lot of different space stuff, like Pluto was named a dwarf planet, water was discovered on the moon, and Kepler was searching for Earth-like planets. I don't know what Kepler is, I just saw it in an article, so yeah. Then there's Tatsugiri Curly Form, and I only put this here because I kept coming across the fact that this material, this very flexible material called graphene, was isolated back in the 2000s. I guess by isolated they mean like they figured out how to actually get it in a physical form. Don't know how important that was, I just kept coming across it, so it must have been pretty important. So yeah, Tatsugiri Curly Form is here because it's like curly, like this material apparently. So yeah, there's the 2000s type, or the 2000s team, which is a dragon type team. That is also one I'm not too proud of. Like the Appleton works pretty well for the whole Apple company, but everything after this, I'm pretty proud of these following teams, especially, well, I guess you'll see as I keep going. Anyway, the 1990s is a rock type team with Iron Thorns as an ace. Iron Thorns is here to represent the internet coming about, and also Google and stuff like that. Then there's Tyrantrum to represent the T-Rex fossil called Sue that was discovered in the 90s. Solrock, because the Hubble Space Telescope was launched. Minior to represent all the goofy, wacky colors of the 90s, and the different colors you could get stuff in, like the N64 and the Game Boy Color and the iMac. Archeops is here because Linux was launched, and the icon for that is a penguin, which is a bird, and Archeops is kind of a bird, so yeah, that's there. And then also Probopass, which is also there to represent the internet and stuff, because, you know, it's a compass, and a compass knows the way, and the internet also knows the way, if you ask it a question. It's a bit of a stretch, but yeah, that's the 1990s. The 1980s is an electric type team led by Toxtricity, which is there to obviously represent metal music, and also Live Aid. Hisuian Electrode is here to represent Pac-Man because it's kind of yellowish, but it is a sphere, so it's like, it's kind of Pac-Man, and he came about in the 80s. Rotom is here to represent the rise of popular video games and also kind of the rise of video games in general, like the SNES, or not the SNES, the NES and Mario and Zelda, all that coming about. Alolan Golem is here to represent many things, including the Chernobyl explosion, because he can learn self-destruct, and also the Mount St. Helens eruption for the same reason. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, because he's kind of a turtle, and they were a thing back then. And also the Berlin Wall, because he's a rock type too, so yeah, that works. Then there's Luxray to represent the whole big hair and punk style of the 80s. And lastly, Arctozolt to represent some Cold War stuff that went down, and also this ice hockey game that was called the Miracle on Ice that happened in one of the Olympics in the 80s. I guess that was a big deal, but, you know, it has ice in its name, and the Cold War is cold in its name, and Arctozolt is a ice type in addition to electric, so yeah, it fits there. So that is the 1980s with an electric type team. The 70s is a dark type team led by Obstagoon to represent new genres of music like glam rock that came out, and also because it's literally based on Kiss, which is from the 70s. Then there's Tyranitar, because the first Earth Day happened in the 70s, and he's a ground type, so that works. Leopard is here to represent, apparently there's a lot of female empowerment that happened in the 1970s, according to this one article I looked at, and Leopard is the most feminine-looking dark type I could find. So yeah. Then there's Greninja. He's here to represent the Watergate scandal that happened, not because he actually has anything to do with it, but he is a water type, so Watergate. Then Sharpedo, who is only here to represent the Jaws movie. Not that that was like a 70s defining thing, maybe it was. He's only here because I saw Jaws was released in the 70s, and I saw that I was already using dark type for the 70s just because of Obstagoon. Then I realized, hey, Sharpedo's a dark type, and it's a shark, so I'll put him in there. Lastly, there's also Morpeko, because this is when Disney World apparently opened, and Morpeko is a mouse, like Mickey Mouse. He's not really a mouse. It's kind of a hamster, but it's a Pikachu clone, and Pikachu's a mouse, so yeah. That is the 70s, a dark-type team. Next up is the 60s, which might be my favorite one I made. It's a psychic-type team led by Exeggutor as an ace, and he's here to represent hippies, because, I mean, look at his face. He kind of looks like one, and he kind of has, like, long hair and everything. I keep calling them he. I guess I should be using it, but... oh well, they're not real, whatever. Then there's Lunatone, because obviously the moon landing happened in the 60s. Rabska is here to represent the beetles, which were obviously very popular, and Rabska is a scarab beetle. Alolan Raichu is here to represent surf culture, because apparently surfing was very popular in the 60s, and when I saw Alolan Raichu, I was like, oh wow, I'm already doing Psychic type for Exeggutor and Lunatone. This works really well, because it's like the only surfing thing in the entire series. Then Screamtail is here to represent men with long hair, and also Beatlemania, which is kind of the term for the whole craze over the Beatles and how all of their fans would kind of scream for them, and scream is obviously in the name Screamtail. And it's also here to represent the Flintstones, because it's obviously an ancient paradox form, and the Flintstones are like cavemen. And then Musharna is here because it's sleeping, so it's probably dreaming, and that's obviously alluding to the I Have a Dream speech. So there is the 60s, a psychic type team, and that might be my favorite one I made. And then there's the 50s, which is a ground type team led by Golem, which represents rock and roll, because that came about roughly around there, and also it's literally a rock type and it rolls, so that works. Sandaconda is here because the double helix DNA structure was, I guess it was discovered in the 50s, and Sandaconda is kind of coiled up like DNA. It obviously isn't a double helix, but it's close enough. Alolan Dugtrio is here to represent the baby boom, which peaked in the 50s apparently, and you know, Alolan Dugtrio kind of looks like a family, and the one's a little baby, so that makes sense. And there's also a normal Dugtrio, which is here to represent the civil rights movement. And I put that here because, like, Doug Trio, it's 3 Diglets together, so it's like they all came together. And the civil rights movement is working towards togetherness, so yeah. And also Nidoqueen is here because this is when Queen Elizabeth was crowned. And lastly, Crocodile to represent the Red Scare that happened. You know, because Crocodile's red, and he's a dark type, so you're probably scared of him. And I believe he can have the Intimidate ability, so that works. And that is the 1950s team, a ground-type team. Next up is the 40s, which is a water type. I wanted to kind of instantly make it a fire-type team just because of the war, but water ended up working really well. So the team is led by Palafin because it has its hero form, and that kind of represents how superheroes like Superman and stuff became popular back in the 40s, and also just to represent the heroes of the war, the World War II. Then there's Blastoise to represent all the guns and tanks and stuff. Lapras to represent the in D-Day, how they came in on barges and stuff, and you know, you ride Lapras, so that works. Then Clamperl to represent Pearl Harbor, because it has Pearl in its name. Mantine to represent fighter planes and also the bombing of Hiroshima, because Mantine is essentially kind of based on a fighter plane, and the Remoraid on it is like a gun, but you could also take it as a bomb. And then Araquanid is here because this is when the Aqua Lung was invented, which is like very early scuba gear. That's obviously a lot less significant than the other things, but Araquanid is essentially like has a breathing device, so that worked out all too well since I was already doing water. And that is the 1940s team. Next up is the 30s, which is a bug-type team led by, this is a little underwhelming, but it's led by Wimpod. And the only reason I put that there is because I already had the rest of the team built based on bug type because it was working really well. But then I wanted the team to be led by something to represent the Great Depression, but no bug type really represented that, so I just did Wimpod because it's like a weak little thing, and that's the closest I could kind of get to a sad bug type to represent Great Depression. Anyway, there's also the Dustox. Sorry, not the Dustox, just Dustox to represent the Dust Bowl, which happened. Obviously, Dustox has dust in its name. Then there's Orbeetle, because of the War of the Worlds alien broadcast that happened, where they kind of pranked a bunch of people and tricked them into thinking aliens were invading. And obviously, Orbeetle is based on like a UFO. Fortress is here to represent the fact that Alcatraz opened in the 30s. Then there's Volcarona to represent the Hindenburg crash. It doesn't really represent it too well, it's just that it's a fire type and it went up in flames, so yeah. And then either Excelgor or Scavalier could be on the team because you have to trade a Shelmet or a Carablast for them to evolve into each other. And that's there to represent the New Deal that was happening in America, because, you know, you're kind of making a deal when you trade a Carablast and a Shelmet. There's the 30s, which is a bug-type team. And lastly, there's the 1920s, which is a flying-type team, and this is another one I'm pretty proud of. I think this one worked out pretty well. It's led by Honchkrow, which is here to represent organized crime and Al Capone and gangsters and stuff, because that's what its design is based on. Then there's Yanmega, because I believe Yanmega's design has some inspiration from planes, so that represents Amelia Earhart. Drifloon is here because people of the 1920s were called the Lost Generation because many people died from the war, and Drifloon's whole thing is that it leads children away, so it's kind of like making them become lost, like the Lost Generation. Then there's Chatot to represent jazz music, Noivern to represent the fact that radios were becoming popular and TVs became a thing because of its little speaker ears. And lastly, Unpheasant is here because, as far as America goes, the 1920s marked the time when more people officially lived in cities than rural areas, and obviously pigeons live in cities, so yeah, that's the 1920s. And that is essentially all of the decades. Well, not every decade in history, but the past couple. And obviously there was a lot of mostly American stuff in there. I didn't really intend for that. I tried to get some other world stuff in there, but I guess since I don't know, I looked up articles of just what happened in each decade. I didn't look up America, and for some reason everything was just mostly America, so that kind of happened. But anyway, to recap, the 2020s is a poison-type specialist, 2010s is a normal-type specialist, 2000s is a dragon-type specialist, 90s is a rock-type specialist, 80s is electric, 70s is dark, 60s is psychic, 50s is ground, 40 is water, 30s is bug, and 20s is flying. So yeah, that was that. This took a little bit to put together, a little bit of time. Definitely the most research I ever had to do for one of these videos. So yeah, thanks for watching.